Hello to everyone. I'm Kerry Moynihan, UVA Club of Washington, D.C. And tonight we're doing a panel with some really terrific guests. Nancy Stoner, who's the president of Potomac River Keepers in Washington, and Paul Henson, who is the head of Fish and Wildlife Service in the state of Oregon. Although he's not here in an official capacity, he's just here as a good friend and of us and of the environment. And we're going to have a little bit of a primer on the Endangered Species Act, on which Paul is an expert, and the Clean Water Act, on which Nancy is an expert. They both have very distinguished and long careers in the field. Paul was a fighting banana slug undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz, and then took his doctorate in wildlife biology at the University of Minnesota. Is an expert on the mating habits of trumpeter swans, among other bird species. And Nancy was in my class at UVA, and then went to Yale Law School and had many years at the EPA, and has had a long experience as an expert in water issues, culminating in her role with really the conservation of the Potomac and Shenandoah watersheds. So we're delighted to have them here. And I'm way out of my league on the subject matter expertise, but we'll open it up to them both and start with Paul, who can kind of, they'll give you a primer on each of the major acts and why you should care and what you can do in the long run. Paul, take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Kerry, and thanks everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to say hi to my friends on the East Coast. So just to be clear, I'm the warm-up act for Nancy. I know she's the headliner here, and she's going to be talking about your home waters there in the Potomac and the Shenandoah and the Blue Ridge Mountains there. I know the area pretty well, going back to DC a fair amount in my official capacity, but taking every chance I can to fish the upper Potomac when I get back there. So, but what I'm going to talk about right now is just, Endangered Species Act 101, real quick. I have about 10 minutes. And so obviously people spend weeks and years training and working in the Endangered Species Act issues. So 10 minutes will be, a little brief to say the least, but should be, at least give you a few fun facts to take home and lead into Nancy's talk. So Michael or Kerry, I can't see this, my presentation. So are you going to put that up and then I can advance with you if we get going? While Michael's doing that, I do want to, just stress to folks, I'm here just as a biologist who worked on endangered species issues for many years, but not as this is not an official U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service presentation or anything like that, although pretty much everything I'm talking about has been things I've learned over my career working in a bunch of different states throughout the West. So I'm really going to, like I said, take about 10 minutes, talk a little bit about the purpose of the Endangered Species Act, implementation of the act on the ground, what we call carrot versus stick, the regulatory impact of the Endangered Species Act versus the sort of proactive voluntary parts of the ESA, and then just a big picture. Of course, transitioning to another administration right now, there's been some pretty significant changes from the previous administration, and how the act is implemented often changes from one administration to the next, but there are some themes that go through, and I'll touch on those. Next slide, please. Michael, you can go ahead and advance. Back one. So many folks know that the primary purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to prevent extinctions of species. That's what people mostly think about. And here's just an old painting of a pastoral scene of people shooting passenger pigeons. Of course, the passenger pigeon is one of America's sort of iconic stories about extinction, going from what were probably billions of birds to none. And the last bird going extinct, I believe, somewhere around 1919 in a zoo in Cleveland, if I got my story straight there. But just the act was put in place to stop extinction, but many people don't realize. Next slide, Mike. That the stated purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to conserve the species and the ecosystems upon which they depend, and that's something that gets lost, I think, with a lot of folks. Next slide. By the way, that's a picture of Crater Lake I took on a flight down to Sacramento from Portland, just a few miles south of Portland here, and this is just a few miles north and west of Crater Lake. And this is the Coast Range, the Oregon Coast Range, from a typical Google Earth shot. And you look at that and you think it's someone's, it's a camouflage, fabric or something. But in fact, that's highly industrial timberlands where timber harvest. It's a mix of private, state, and federal land, and it's mostly clear-cut industrial lands. There's very little to almost no old-growth forest in that picture of, I don't know, that's probably 20 square miles or so. So next slide, but that's also an ecosystem view of what we're working in throughout the West. And of course, you can't keep species really from going extinct, certainly not in the wild, if you don't conserve those landscapes, those systems that they all exist in, and the ecological processes that occur on those lands, which includes the fire cycle or the flood cycle or the soil formation cycle or the hydrological cycle, as Nancy will talk about. And these are just 4 typical habitats in Oregon, but really represent, pretty much anywhere in the West and aspects of even other parts of the country, Northwest forests, Western river plains, sagebrush and sage grouse, and of course prairie. And we have a fair amount of prairie actually out here in the Northwest. Next slide. So of course talking about preventing extinction, some of the original goals with the Endangered Species Act back in the early 70s when it was signed into law was to reduce direct exploitation of declining species. That's a Western rhino there. But also the issues, and certainly when you're talking about ecosystems, it's gotten much broader, dealing with invasive species. That's a brown tree snake. I worked for several years in Guam, and that's a Micronesian kingfisher. And out in those islands where you have introduced species, they can cause the extinction of the native species pretty quickly. And in fact, I was just, some of you might have heard yesterday about the state of Florida prohibiting sale of really regulating the pet trade now because of snakes, lizards, non-native fishes in the systems in Florida. And that was a huge event and a huge decision. The other big issues are habitat loss, and an umbrella over all those issues is climate change, which will, is exacerbating a whole variety of other impacts to species, whether it's, melting sea ice there on the left with polar bears, or it's fires and changing the natural fire cycle and exacerbating it. And we had one of our worst fire years ever here in Oregon this past September. And I had actually several of my employees lost their homes to wildfires this past year. Next slide, please. So, I'm just going to briefly talk about how the ESA works on the ground. I don't think it's the most interesting part of hearing how we, get together and negotiate, permits and things like that under the Endangered Species Act. But the bottom line is that the ESA regulates other federal agencies and federal actions primarily. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, and for marine species, NOAA, the National Marine Fisheries Service in NOAA, regulates with us to primarily other federal agencies' actions. So if you're building a road on federal lands, or you're building a dam, or something where you need a federal permit, you're filling a wetland to build a shopping mall, and there's an endangered species there, you need a permit from us, from Fish and Wildlife Service. But it also prohibits take of listed species. So you can't go out and shoot a spotted owl or cut down a nest tree without a permit, even if it's on your private property. And so it regulates the wildlife on private lands, and federal lands and state lands. And so then federal agencies or private landowners will quote unquote consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service on those actions. We'll issue what's called a biological opinion. Once we determine that it won't cause the extinction of the species, what's a term that's called jeopardy in the Endangered Species Act. And most projects go forward either as proposed or in some modified form to reduce or avoid those impacts. But the more important part of the ESA working on the ground is planning for species long-term recovery. So the goal is, as you're having impacts to species, you're also recovering species, and hopefully, you're in the plus column at the end of the day. And that's what we're trying to do on all these species. Next slide. So, and getting to the point, the Endangered Species Act, while it's often viewed, certainly in kind of historically, and certainly in some of the sort of anti-regulation type literature and political and policy discussion as a very aggressive regulatory statute, it's actually just as much, if not even more, a kind of a voluntary or providing different kinds of incentives, and that's important because there's no way we're going to recover species and keep species from going extinct just by regulating or stopping things. You need to do things proactively. You need to intervene. So you need to step in to restore habitats or natural processes to these large landscapes, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. You need to reintroduce extirpated species, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. You need to control invasive species, and there's probably nothing more important in huge parts of the country now than controlling invasive species, plants, fish. Every part of the country has their invasive species nightmares that we're working on. So you can't just stop actions. You got to work with people to encourage and enable proactive actions. And that takes a collaborative approach, working on all lands, including private lands. And out here in Oregon now, I spend a fair amount of time working with ranchers on issues from sage grouse to wolves, to endangered plants, to fish, to bull trout and salmon issues. Next slide, please. So I'll just mention that, I talked about putting things back, reintroducing species. Once you are able to secure habitat or restore some habitat, you can actually put species back or help the few remaining ones grow and restore the populations. This is just a few of kind of the pictures of a few of the sort of well-known critters. That's a black-footed ferret, gray wolves, Pacific fisher, California condor, grizzly bear, whooping crane, and California sea otter. In fact, my first job out of undergraduate was working on sea otters down in Big Sur, California, catching otters and tracking them up and down the California coast and out into the Channel Islands. And we're in fact considering a reintroduction project in Oregon right now for putting sea otters back in Oregon. They're down in California and they're up in Washington and Alaska, but we don't have them in Oregon anymore because they were hunted out of existence here. We're going to be releasing condors in Redwood National Park, just south of the Oregon border, this summer, hopefully, in a big collaborative project with the Park Service and some local Native American tribes. But you can do these things, put them back. And some of course, have heard about wolves. We've just recently delisted gray wolves in the lower 48 states. Wolves are expanding. They've been in Oregon for about 15 years, and now we have a couple wolf packs in California. And we have a wolf from Oregon that's actually right now south of Lake Tahoe. And so they're continuing to expand and take back that habitat if you deal with the limiting factors that were there that made them get put on the endangered species list in the first place. Next slide. And so I'll mention just a couple of species here in Oregon, and Michael, you can hit the next slide, click too. But this was a Oregon chub, this little fish that lives in the backwaters, and I brought this up because in part because it's a very similar system to the Potomac in that it's a semi-urban river. It terminates, the Willamette River flows north down the Willamette Valley into the Columbia River just north of Portland. And then the Columbia flows out to the ocean out at Astoria. This was a fish that was listed because of all the damming and diking and conversion to agriculture that occurred in the Willamette Valley, because this was the end of the Oregon Trail. This was the and tremendous agricultural land, and it was settled. And this was a fish that there was only maybe 20 little populations left of this fish. It only exists in this valley here, south of Portland. And it was through working with private landowners and them agreeing to let us put them back into their ponds and into their river backwater areas, and then dealing with some of the predators, like non-native predators like bull trout and bass, smallmouth bass. We were able to recover the species and take it off the list. And it was the first fish delisted, I should say, under the Endangered Species Act anywhere in the country. And so it's created a kind of a momentum now for continuing to delist and recover species that here in Oregon, and then also more broadly in the Pacific Northwest. Next slide. And here's another example, also in the Willamette Valley. This is a FENDER'S blue butterfly. Was first described in the 1920s. It was thought to be extinct and hadn't been seen for over 50 years. It was listed when it was rediscovered. And we've been recovering it over these last 15 years, which involves restoring prairie, burning prairie, restoring some of the native plants that are nectar and egg-laying plants for this species. And I'm pretty sure this year or next year, we're probably going to be delisting it. And again, that was with the help of a lot of private landowners, that once you approach them and ask for their help and figure out ways that they won't be regulated in such a way that harms their economic livelihood or their private property rights, most people are actually pretty willing to help. And that's what happened with this critter. And I'm looking forward to taking it off the list. Next slide, please. And it's not just taking things off the list or keeping them from going extinct. It's actually working to try and avoiding the need to list. And this is the Pacific fisher, which is like a giant weasel. It's in the mustelid family. It's the largest of the mustelids on land. The sea otter is the largest in the overall. But it lives up in the trees in the Pacific Northwest and then across the country. And I'm pretty sure you probably have some down in the Appalachian and the Blues and Smoky Mountains. But the Western population in Oregon, Washington, California was petitioned to be listed. We ended up working out agreements with landowners and with the federal landowners, private landowners. We did a bunch of reintroductions in California and in Washington, and we're hoping to do some in Oregon over the next couple of years. And we avoided the need to list it, and we decided not to put it on the ESA because we essentially are taking care of it without needing to bring in the powers of the ESA. And sometimes the desire to keep something off the list, the Endangered Species Act list, is probably as a motivating incentive as you could have. And certainly if you're a land manager in the West. So anyway, that's a type of thing we're trying to do more proactively. Next slide, please. And I'll get ready to segue to Nancy here by putting in a river shot and some fish. This is another sort of restoring a system that the Endangered Species Act enables us to do. We use funding and authority from the Act. And this was a project to restore bull trout passage. Bull trout it's the Western version of brook trout. It's a char. It's a kind of an apex predator, sort of the wolf of the river. It eats a lot of small fish, including salmon and steelhead smolt. And so they were extirpated in a lot of parts of the West as a predator of trout and salmon. And we've been putting them back for years now into various systems, but we need to provide passage and movability. And there's a picture of just an old culvert that was a barrier to fish passage. And that project on the upper part is daylighting that stream. There's willows and stuff planted along there. It'll be revegetated, but now fish can move up and down this stream and they'll have access to all that headwater habitat. I'm sure it's something that Nancy and the Potomac folks are very familiar with as well. So next slide. So I'm just going to close with this last, statement about the Endangered Species Act is working, and I think it's working really well. although you hear people saying, people who are not really supportive of the ESA or the implications it sometimes has, we haven't delisted so many species, and there's 1,500 or so species on the list, and we've only delisted 10 or 20 or 30. Well, I just put that graph up there to show you how the trend towards delisting and recovery has gone up dramatically over the last decade or so. And it's working. It is not just saving species from extinction. 99-point-something% of species that get listed are actually stopped from going extinct, and then taking those species and recovering them. But that takes time. We're talking about reversing what amounts to 1 or 2 centuries of impact in many cases. And the Act has tremendous public support, but it takes that support to make it work and that participation. So with that, I'm going to transition here and turn over to Nancy. And if folks have questions I think you can chat up Michael or Carrie, and we can talk about it after Nancy's presentation. Thank you.
That's a perfect segue. And, so much of this is about preserving the interstice of preserving the environment and preserving the species. And, there's a really wonderful Venn diagram with what both of you do. And Nancy, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, Paul. And I want to thank you for your years of public service to the American public and all the great species that you've worked to protect. That was fantastic, and the ESA is a great law. So I'm really delighted to hear that presentation. Michael, if you'll put up my first slide, please. And while he's doing that, I want to thank everybody for joining this afternoon. It's great to talk to my fellow UVA alums. You have to start by acknowledging the sad time we're in, that we are no longer in the March Madness, but we'll always have 2019. So,
but the ducks and the beavers are.
Right. There you go.
Well, let's
All right,
not
so
get
that's
into
me.
let's not get into factionalism here. But
Yeah.
we'll always have Paris.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly right, Carrie. All right, so this is me, the Nancy Stoner. I'm the president of the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. And if you just move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about both the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers, because they are all part of the same system, and we protect them both. So there you see the watershed right there. And that's the way we think of how we're located in the water world, is what watershed are we in? Our watershed is almost 15,000 square miles. It starts up in the mountains of West Virginia and in the mountains of the Shenandoah. I'm from Waynesboro, and probably a lot of UVA alums remember Waynesboro as that little bitty town that was over the mountain from Charlottesville. As I was saying to Carrie, worse than being a townie is to be from a town that's too small to be a townie, and that's where I'm from. It's in fact too small to be on the map. You can see Stanton, but you don't see Waynesboro on the map. But anyway, it's the headwaters of the Shenandoah River. The two rivers meet in Harper's Ferry, and we have a river keeper for each segment. So one for the upper Potomac, one for the Shenandoah, and one for the lower Potomac. As I said, it's almost 15,000 square miles. It's a really big job protecting this watershed, and it's a very diverse and beautiful watershed. So I'm going to show you a few pictures of beautiful places along the river. You can move to the next slide at any point. It's also known as the Nations River. George Washington called it the Nations River, as he, of course, maneuvered to get the capital along it, right? So here you've got upstream from DC in the Potomac Gorge, a beautiful photo there with some kayakers. Next slide. And this is in the upper Potomac. This is in the upper Potomac. The names are not very meaningful. This is the North Fork South Branch, but up in West Virginia. Just breathtaking. Next slide. And this is in the Shenandoah. So the photo on the left is by Alan Lehman, who's our program manager in the Shenandoah. And of course, you see all the people using and enjoying the Shenandoah on the right. It is a big tourist draw, lots of people kayaking and fishing and canoeing and so forth, always in the Shenandoah. That beautiful backdrop of the mountains just makes it lovely. Next slide, please. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Potomac before and after the Clean Water Act, and how the Clean Water Act has helped protect our rivers and restore our rivers. A very similar story really to what Paul was talking about with the Endangered Species Act. So I love this little picture in the center. So this is, as the caption says, 1922. And you'll notice that the Washington Monument is in the background. This is the tidal basin. And there were beaches along the tidal basin in 1922. The police officer there is measuring the lengths of the swimsuits to make sure there's not too much skin showing. It's pretty funny. But the point of this photograph from my standpoint is the vision that it shows, that the idea of having a swimmable Potomac, which is our goal at the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. That's not just a dream. We used to have that. We can have that again. And there are strategies and technologies that can make that happen. So we believe in that vision. On the bottom right, you'll see what the Potomac looked like in 1973. This is actually Georgetown. That's Watergate in the background. So there were lots of things going on in 1973 at the Watergate. But the one that's important here is the pollution that was flowing into the Potomac there, raw sewage and all kinds of contaminants that were not yet regulated under the Federal Clean Water Act. So that it was pretty much an open sewer at that point, and that's pretty much the worst that it got. President Johnson declared it a national disgrace in 1965. DC put in a swim ban, saying it was never safe to swim. But then the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And that led the way to restoration. Next slide, please.
Nancy, let me ask you a question, interject. Wasn't it during the Nixon administration? He doesn't get a lot of credit, but wasn't the EPA started during the Nixon administration, and he was actually pretty instrumental in a lot of environmental stuff.
Yeah, that's right. He started the EPA, which I worked at for many years. And the Clean Water Act was passed. He actually was not very fond of the Clean Water Act and vetoed it, and Congress overrode his veto. What Nixon was worried about was the cost of the Clean Water Act at that time. And the first program actually that I've got on this slide here, the construction grants program, was considered a very expensive program at the time. It was a program to build sewage treatment plants across the United States, or upgrade sewage treatment plants. And it has made a huge difference in terms of water quality across the country. But that led Nixon to veto it. The other programs here, the NPDES, or Industrial Discharge Program, or what that really is the pollution permitting program of the Clean Water Act. That's the program that limits discharges by discrete sources like factories and so forth. Again, a very successful program that has made a tremendous difference in terms of water quality. The stormwater program was put in place in 1987. That's the program that protects waterways from the pollutants that are carried by rain when they hit hardscape, like pavement, buildings, and so forth. All the contaminants that are on those are then mobilized by the rain and carried, usually untreated, into the waterways. That's been, I'd say, a partially successful program. It's very difficult to control development once it occurs, and to protect the waterways. Paul talked a lot about different kinds of landscapes, forests and wetlands. The next program, those are the most important in terms of protecting rivers. Wetlands, as you probably know, are called nature's kidneys because they clean the water. They also trap floodwaters. They're increasingly important as climate change occurs and makes bigger and bigger storm events over time. So flooding is a huge issue, and wetlands are our best protection. And then the last program there is the Chesapeake Bay program, which is a funding program. Congress appropriates funds that go to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That's the largest estuary in the United States, the Chesapeake Bay, to help pay for nutrient pollution reduction to deal with the dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay. So all of those programs have been the ones that have been in place since 1972, again, almost 50 years, and have really restored waterways across the country. This is another photo of the Potomac Gorge. How about that? Pretty fantastic. A stand-up paddleboarder is riding the waves there. And the next slide, please. So Carrie asked me to talk about how state programs work with the federal government in the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act is a program that is implemented by both the federal and state governments working together. So I showed you some of those programs, the federal government programs or the Clean Water Act programs. But for example, the pollution permitting program actually uses the state water quality standards to decide what goes in a permit. And the states set those standards based on the uses of the water. So is it used for irrigation? Is it used for habitat, drinking water? And so we protect waters based on our uses of them to make sure they're usable for the public. Then the states work to meet those standards using a variety of tools, both regulatory tools and funding tools, private tools, like the kinds that Paul was talking about. And then states often create their own programs to supplement the federal authority. And one of the programs we use in Virginia is the Agricultural Stewardship Act. And that's because the Federal Clean Water Act is not particularly strong in protecting waterways from agricultural pollution. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk now about what we do at the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. Our role is to protect everyone's right to clean water, the public's right to clean water. And we do that by stopping pollution and enhancing public use and enjoyment. We use assessment, advocacy, and enforcement. So assessment is really using science, getting the science like you see the Shenandoah Riverkeeper doing there on the left, taking a water quality monitoring sample, using that science, following that to find the causes of the pollution and the solutions. And then we use advocacy to bring those solutions into effect. We use enforcement to enforce existing laws like the Federal Clean Water Act or those state clean water laws that I talked about. And when there isn't a law in place to enforce, to stop the pollution, we work to pass one. We work with people throughout the watershed, organize them to help fill those gaps. The center photo here is our research vessel. It's called the Potomac, it's called Sea Dog, which was the name given to it by the retired 4-star admiral who gave it to the Potomac Riverkeeper Network to use for our water quality monitoring program. It has our lab on it. It's normally docked at National Harbor in Prince George's County. And then the photo on the right, that's the upper Potomac Riverkeeper, Brent Walls, and he's flying a drone. He's actually the nation's expert in using drones to document and identify the sources of water pollution. Next slide, please. So our approach is to be the experts of the rivers that we work to protect. So the river keepers are required to live in the watersheds that they work to protect. They're required to have a boat, they're required to patrol, and they're required to have a grassroots constituency that they work with to protect the watershed. They're the voice of the river, they're the eyes and ears of the river. And as I said, they gather information themselves. They also use community members to help them gather the science necessary to find solutions and then to advocate to get them in place, whether it's through regulations, through laws, through voluntary action and so forth to make them happen. And that's the Shenandoah Riverkeeper out there on patrol. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a few examples of the kinds of things that we do. This is Dean Nyox, the Potomac Riverkeeper on the right. He's in front of the Morgantown plant, which is near the 301 bridge, for those of you familiar with this area in Maryland. And it's a coal-fired power plant. So when coal is burned to generate energy, ash is created. And the ash is filled with toxins and metals and all kinds of stuff that you don't want in your drinking water, that you don't want in your river, that you don't want in your fish. And until recently, state of the art basically was to add water to the ash and throw it in a pond. If you look at the slide on the left, that's Possum Point, that's near Dumfries in Northern Virginia along the Potomac. The pond that you see on the top right is actually a coal ash pit. So it's filled with ash as well as water. It's right next to the Potomac River. And it's also near some homes that had contaminated drinking water from the leaching of that coal ash pit. So the federal law was pretty weak on dealing with coal ash. And so we worked with the states. We worked with Maryland and we worked with Virginia to get legislation passed that requires effective treatment of this coal ash so it wouldn't continue to leach into the river and into the groundwater. Required either recycling of the coal ash, it can be made into cement, which is actually a valuable product, or it can be put in a modern landfill with liners and leachate collection to make sure that it doesn't go into the waterway. And we work with people whose drinking water was affected by these toxins in making this happen. Next slide.
May I interject? And it's really about, and Paul can probably weigh in on this as well, but you're both dealing with a very complicated matrix of state, federal, in some cases, municipal, county regulations, and can you just both of you speak briefly to how the heck do you do that? Because well, the state is for it and the feds are against it. I'm making that up, but directionally it's correct, and you both are having to navigate those kinds of issues all the time.
Paul, do you want to say something about it?
Yeah, I guess I could say that, Kerry's correct. There's never any disagreement between the federal government and state governments. And being a student of—
Hold on, that's the official position of the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yeah, just like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison saw eye to eye on all federal and states' rights type issues. But I will say, first of all, the Clean Water Act, in contrast to the ESA, does have mechanisms for the federal government, the EPA, for example, delegating authorities to the state that if the state has a program in place to carry it out. And certain states have delegated Clean Water Act authorities, as Nancy knows, and others don't, because they don't have a program to do that. So there's collaboration right there. But in the Endangered Species Act, we don't really have a mechanism for delegating, take authorities and of endangered species. But what there are is most states have some sort of Endangered Species Act. I'm not sure if all the 50 states do, but most do. And we usually work, the Fish and Wildlife Service with state fish and game agencies, state fish and wildlife agencies, as well as other state agencies. We usually work really closely together. And in fact, just in the minutes before I got on this call, I was on with my state counterparts at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Oregon Department of Ag on some endangered plants in Eastern Oregon, and working with some private landowners. And so we work together that way. But occasionally there is differences in opinions for sure between the state and federal government on what to do on very specific issues. And sometimes that gets adjudicated in court.
So as Paul said, under the Clean Water Act program, in addition to the water quality standards that I mentioned that states set, that's right, most states, almost every state now actually has the pollution permitting program as well. And it is it's a federal law, but it's implemented primarily at the state level. And I think the example that I gave is a good one of what we do. So if the federal law addresses something, then we try to address it under the federal law. And the strongest tool we have is called the citizen suit provision, which enables anybody who's adversely impacted by pollution to stop that pollution. So we sue on behalf of our members to use that tool. But if there is no federal law, then we work to pass a state law. And that's exactly what we did in Virginia on coal ash, is we worked with the Virginia General Assembly to pass a law to address the problem because the federal government had not yet addressed it. This example right here, actually sewer overflows, is another example where we worked with the Virginia General Assembly. Here, you'll see the sign on the left. That's a sign that tells you that that's where sewers overflow when it rains. This is at the Georgetown waterfront. On the right, no, that's right. Where all those kayakers are and stand-up paddle boarders, that's where the sewers overflow. And when that happens, raw sewage goes right into the waterway. And this is from the design of the sewers in both DC and Alexandria. The photo on the right, which is not a very good photo, which I will acknowledge right at the outset, I put it there because it has a good story behind it. So this was taken by the Potomac Riverkeeper, D. Nyax. He was out doing stand-up paddleboarding with his wife and his daughter right where he lives, which is Bellhaven Marina in Alexandria. And there they were out in the water. It wasn't raining, but it had been raining earlier in the day. And he sees this huge torrent of sewage flowing toward them as they're in the river with the stand-up paddle boards. So Dean grabbed his wife and his daughter, ran the heck out of there, and turned around and snapped this photo. So this is not 1973. This is last summer. So this is an issue today in the Potomac River. And so what did we do? Well, in Alexandria, where this occurred, we worked with the Virginia General Assembly to get requirements in place that Alex Renew, which is the utility there in the city, worked together to put in controls to capture and treat the sewage that's in the sewers so that it doesn't overflow. So the technologies exist to do this, and we just have to invest in them as a society.
And Nancy, how do our listeners or our audience contribute to a solution for this kind of thing? Because that's just horrific.
Yeah, so this is a great example of where people definitely can contribute. And there's something very specific I can suggest about this one. Go to a rate hearing. In order to invest in these solutions, the sewer authority needs you to contribute to those investments. So if you go to the rate hearing and you say, this is a worthwhile investment, I want to be able to swim safely in the Potomac River, and I'm willing to make that investment as a ratepayer, that has a huge, huge impact. So I would suggest that in particular with respect to combined sewer overflows. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about other ways to get involved too, Carrie. Don't worry, okay?
I knew you would.
So the biggest issue in the Shenandoah is agricultural pollution. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the one that, in my view, is dealt with at least effectively in the federal law. So we work with the state laws. The Agricultural Stewardship Act is one that we use that enables us to identify where there are herds of cattle defecating in the river, as you see in the picture on the left, right next to people who are recreating. This creates a public health hazard. So we report those to the state, who works with the farmer to put in exclusionary fencing. We also work with the Virginia General Assembly to get money to go to the farmer, cost share dollars to go to the farmer to pay for that exclusionary fencing. And it used to be that it built the fence but didn't maintain it. Now we got funding also to maintain the fences as well as build the fences and to build the alternative watering source for the cattle. So we've gotten about 80% of the herds of cattle out of the Shenandoah using that approach. When we don't get them out of there, that problem, and then poultry is the other big one, where there are about 200 million birds raised in the Shenandoah every year. They cause that thick filamentous algae that you see demonstrated on the right. That's from having too much manure in the water. When you have 200 million birds, you have a lot of manure generated, more than the crops can beneficially use, and it ends up in the water and it grows that disgusting algae. Next slide, please. But there are solutions for that too. And manure, of course, is valuable. So we just need it in the right places at the right rates. So how can you help? That's what Carrie just asked about, and you're all probably wondering now about that right now. How can I help? How can I be a part of it? Well, part of it is to be a water quality monitor. So we monitor for E. coli bacteria, for temperature, for pH and turbidity. People are mostly interested in the E. coli, which tells you whether you're going to get sick if you swim in the water. We do it every week during the summer. We do it with volunteers. In a volunteer run program, in a boat that was donated, with a slip that was donated, with a water quality lab that was donated. It's a highly leveraged program, and it provides information that people are really anxious to get about whether it's safe to swim. And it is safe to swim a lot of the time in the Potomac, but it's not always safe. So you want to know whether it is or not before you go in.
And Nancy, just take a moment, because you mentioned turbidity. I'm not familiar with that. What does it mean in this context of water safety?
Yes, so turbidity means how cloudy is the water, how much can you see through it.
Okay.
And in turbidity, if it's really cloudy, often that means there's a lot of contaminants that have been dumped in the water. So it actually correlates pretty highly with high bacteria levels and other kinds of contaminants in the water. Turbidity. Next slide, please. So another thing you can do is to document and report pollution. So there's an app for that that we use called Water Reporter. By the way, there's an app for the checking the water quality results too that I should have mentioned, called Swim Guide. Look at the places you go in the water and check Swim Guide, and you'll see the results and whether it's safe to go in the water, green, yellow, or red. But so the idea of this is, you can tell, if you see a water body and it's the wrong color, what's wrong with this water body? It's the wrong color, right? Or it smells bad, or you see a discharge that looks to you like it's a problem. Well, it probably is a problem. So report it to us and we will investigate it. In fact, we're working to create teams of people called rapid response teams that can expand our reach so we can investigate more kinds of pollution. This particular place, which is in the upper Potomac, Toms Creek, Pennsylvania, someone reported this problem. And the upper Potomac Riverkeeper took his drones, you saw him earlier with his drones, and he flew over the facility upstream from this called Specialty Granules. And they had a huge pond that looked just like this that was discharging into the waterway. And it was from the asphalt shingle manufacturing plant that was located there. And once he showed him the pictures, This is what's in the river. This is what's in your pond. They decided they would fix it, and they did. It now has the most sophisticated water treatment system of any asphalt shingles manufacturer in the United States. So someone just asked in the chat what the two apps were. So thank you, Lisa. The woman who runs our water quality monitoring program just responded. Swim Guide is the app that you look at to get the results of the water quality testing. Swim Guide, it's called. You can use it not just in the Potomac and the Shenandoah, but actually all over the country. You can use that. And Water Reporter is the one you can use if you see a problem, or you can just call the hotlines that are on our website as well. Let me keep going there, please. Next slide. You can also do advocacy. So you can go to a public meeting. I mentioned rate hearings. There's hearings on permits. There's all kinds of zoning hearings, other kinds of hearings you can come to. You can send in letters. We would love to have your voice join ours in fighting to stop pollution. And then you can go to a protest. So this one on the right here is the Upper Potomac Riverkeeper protesting a fracked gas pipeline. We actually got the support of Governor Hogan in Maryland in opposing that pipeline, and have succeeded in stopping it so far. It's in litigation, and we in the state of Maryland are on the same side fighting this pipeline, which wouldn't have benefited Marylanders at all because the governor had already banned fracking in Maryland. This pipeline would have gone underneath the Potomac River and threatened the river and the areas around it. Next slide. You can also help if you want to get your feet wet and your hands dirty by helping us with a river cleanup. These are pictures of us doing a cleanup with the Friends of the North Fork in the Shenandoah. We just had a big cleanup in Oxen Cove near National Harbor, where we pulled out, I think it was 50 some shopping carts out of the water. We had to have heavy equipment to do it. If you want to do cleanups, look on our website. We have some planned for Alexandria and National Harbor all spring, including stand-up paddleboard cleanups if you want to get out on the water to get trash out of the water as well as the shore.
And don't you have one scheduled for the day before Earth Day, April 22nd?
Yeah, we actually do have one scheduled with UVA's, what is it, Earth Cares? Is that what it's called? What's the group called, Carrie?
Michael is better equipped to answer that than I am, but yeah, I think there are opportunities if people want to get involved and actually put on your, Wellingtons and muck around in the Potomac and pick stuff out, and also you can do this. Then put on your good shoes and do political advocacy as well. But you can make a difference.
Yeah, and that was in the latest newsletter from the UVA Club of Washington, D.C. So if you check in that, you'll get the details of how to participate in that service event. Thanks for mentioning that, Carrie. We also, we don't just pull trash out of the water or off the shore. We also work with the legislatures again to address the sources of contamination. We banned styrofoam in working with the Virginia General Assembly this year, and with lots of colleagues through the Virginia Conservation Network. Next slide, please. And as Paul mentioned, so there's lots of ways that individuals can get involved as well in protecting waterways. So if you own land along the Shenandoah or the Potomac, one of the things that you can do is to fence the cattle out of the water and then put in a stream buffer instead. So that helps rebuild the bank and of course filter out the pollution. Trees, vegetation, those are the best filters that are out there. And you'll see where that happened here. You can't see quite as much difference in the water just from these photographs as you can by going out on the water in a kayak. You would be amazed what a difference it makes when you put in stream buffers instead of cattle trampling the banks of the river. It's fantastic. Next slide, please. And then a new program we have is freshwater mussel restoration. So I mentioned that the stormwater program is partially successful, I would say. Very difficult to deal with stormwater runoff. That's an example of a situation where you're always going to have some pollution that comes from urban areas into the waterways. So what do? So we get freshwater mussels to filter out the pollution after it's already in the river. So freshwater mussels are like oysters, filter feeders. And these are not the mussels you eat, by the way. My understanding is they taste bad, and I think that's because they're capturing all the toxins there. And apparently they also are not easy to chew. But you can see the results on the aquarium in the right. So those freshwater mussels were in there only 4 hours, and look what a difference they made. Isn't that fantastic? So we want to get 50 million in the river. So again, you could be involved in helping us to do that. Next slide, please. Oh, so I'm at this point, I'm late. I'm going to slide through. Here's some of the beautiful wildlife that we see along the Potomac River. And the next one, please.
Cormorants on the right there.
Yeah,
and we'll leave some
we have
time for
bottlenose
questions.
dolphins back in the river now because of the increasing water quality. These are downstream from DC. There's about 1,000 so far identified. They're breeding in the water. It's just fabulous. I can look at Gary's face. He's all excited about the dolphins.
We have dolphins?
We have dolphins.
I did not know that. That's a revelation. It really is. So
look up Dr. Janet Mann at Georgetown. You'll see that she has been documenting where these dolphins are.
Holy cow.
And we actually have a dolphin cruise that someone won at our gala this year. They bid on going on a dolphin cruise with Dr. Janet Mann. So how about that? Wouldn't that be fantastic? All right, next slide, please. And the American shad is another example. This is an anadromous fish, and they were almost completely gone in the Potomac due to pollution and due to the dams and so forth. And this gentleman who's from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the hero here, Paul, who helped develop a program to bring them back, in part doing fish ladders and things like that, but also working with elementary school children to harvest the roe and put them in the water and so forth. This is actually not something the Potomac Riverkeeper Network did, but Mike Odom here from the Fish and Wildlife Service did this program. It's been a huge success. You can now go catch shad right off Fletcher's Boathouse, right outside of DC. This is the Potomac Riverkeeper Network's daughter and her shad that she caught last spring. Just a fabulous story of restoration. Next slide. Smallmouth bass, again, great fishing in the Shenandoah and the Potomac. The fish are showing some population depletion issues, and the Shenandoah Riverkeeper, who is a fishing guide, has gotten together the fishing guides with the scientists. They will get together this Friday to talk about the different kinds of stresses on the fish population and how they can work together to address them. Next slide. And the most important thing is that you can come out with us and have fun. So we have a whole series of activities in the summer called Riverpalooza, and there's one for specifically for Spanish-speaking members of the watershed called Riopalooza. And we have snorkeling, we have rafting, we have tubing, we have kayaking, we have fun. And we had none of it last summer because we canceled it all for COVID. So we are really raring to go. So please check our website and come out and have fun with us on the river. And then the next slide. So here's my main message, just in case you missed it. Our rivers are worth saving. And this is a beautiful picture with Georgetown University in the background there and the Key Bridge. and the beautiful, beautiful Potomac River. And the last slide is thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you. Wahoo wah!
Well, thank you, Nancy, and this is just terrific because again, it's you know, we love the beauty of it. We love being able to kayak. I honestly haven't done a lot of swimming in the Potomac, but yeah, I feel a lot better about the prospect of that given your talk. And fishing and so on, and it's important to the interstice of protecting the environment and then protecting the species that goes along with it. And
Carrie?
I'll open it up a bit to questions. We had a couple. People asked how can I volunteer to help clean up the Potomac, and you know, I think you have a good, you know, if you reach out to Nancy and look at Potomac River Keepers, and how's the explosion of interest in water sports, you know, paddle boarding and all that, and you know, particularly with COVID, it's interesting because I think more people are doing that with social distancing. You know, it's easy to keep your distance from somebody on the river. How is that? Has that found its way to more support for your organization?
Yeah, so that's absolutely correct. So our estimate is there are about a third more people out on the water this past year. And that is in part because there's a lot of open space out there, as you say. You can get out in your kayak, your canoe, and have, you know, the calming effect of access to nature, but also social distancing out there. I remember, Carrie, you asked me to talk about swimming in the Potomac now, and I forgot to do that. So we do support open water swims in the Potomac.
Yes.
We provide the water quality monitoring and testing to make sure that it's safe for people to go in. We have one coming up in September this year called Shark Fest. It's not because we have sharks in the Potomac, but instead because it started out at Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay. Now they have events all around the world. And we partner with the Special Olympics on that event. And so if you participate in that event, you can help support both the Potomac Riverkeeper Network and Special Olympics. We had more than 100 people swim in the Potomac for Shark Fest 2 years ago. Last year it was canceled for COVID. So we're looking forward to doing that in September and getting people out and enjoying open water swims in the Potomac.
Are people also fishing more? And you know, this is something for Paul, who's an avid fisherman. Are they fishing more, not just in the upper reaches of the watershed, but close in? I'm reminded of Cole Porter. Why ask if shad do it? Waiter, bring me shad roe. You know, is there more of that now? And can people, with some degree of certainty, feel like they can be fishing in the lower Potomac, you know, close to the city?
I don't know, Paul, did you want to say anything about fishing, or you want to leave that one to me?
Well, I'll just say that we're probably one of the advantages of working for Fish and Wildlife Services. I get to occasionally visit Shepherdstown and our National Conservation Training Center there that some of you locals might be familiar with. And it's on the banks of the Potomac above Harper's Ferry. And I always bring my fly rod and little 3-weight fly rod and a bunch of flies and go fishing after class, after training. I'm teaching class, whatever. And, you know, staying light out till 9 at night. And that's just probably my favorite part of the Potomac. And so and that's actually not, you know, that's not up in the mountains. That's still down low. So
pretty close, yeah.
I don't know the river well enough to comment beyond that. It's a nice break from Oregon cold water fishery. It's a little warm water and wet wading. I don't have to wear waders because I'm not in, you know, 49-degree water. like I am in parts of Oregon where I fish. So
there are definitely a lot of people out fishing as well. Again, that's a great solo activity you can do with your family and socially distanced from other people. I see that people are asking about that. I do not believe there's a ban on catch and release fishing for shad in the Potomac. There was one, I think, some time ago, but I don't believe there is anymore. And they also ask about snakeheads. So
That's an interesting question.
yeah, so there's two invasives. I mean, there's more than that, but there's two very well-known invasive snakeheads and blue catfish in the Potomac. And you probably remember a few years ago, there was all this, brouhaha over whether the snakeheads had gotten in the river. Well, they did. There's plenty of snakeheads in the river. And that's a great fish to catch and eat.
Really?
Because they taste good.
Hold on, I just frame that. Snakeheads were, if memory serves, an invasive species that came from Southeast Asia, and essentially, to use Paul's phrase about the bull trout, they're like the apex predator. They'll eat anything. Yeah, am I remembering that right?
Well, so there was a lot of concern that snakeheads were going to eat everything. Absolutely. And I do think that they eat a lot of different kinds of fish, but it turns out that the blue catfish eat a lot more than the snakeheads do. And so the blue catfish is actually more of a problem in terms of depleting the fish population than the snakeheads. But both of them are good fish to eat. So if you catch it, what's illegal is to throw the snakehead back in alive. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is take them out and have a snakehead roast or a blue catfish. I've had those as well, and they're very good to eat as well. One of my ideas is to have a bake-off someday where we have, people bring in all their recipes for snakeheads and blue catfish.
Now, let me ask you, where would you get these? Would you go down to the wharf in DC? Are they selling those, down by the Anthem and the wharf that you could get those fish?
I think you can get snakeheads in a large area of the Potomac River. They're everywhere, pretty much, I think. And the shad, I mentioned the shad so they will start running in the spring here pretty soon. I'm not sure exactly. And you can definitely catch those right outside of DC. So there's a lot of good fishing in the Potomac, as well as the Shenandoah.
I don't know why I won't analogize too much of the nasty, will eat anything, live on the bottom kind of fish species, and analogize those to our native wildlife here on Capitol Hill or anything like that. But they're native to our country, so we'll just have to live with them. Any other questions that we have? Hold on, let me look at the, here we go.
People are sharing information on where to catch fish, which is great.
Lampreys, do we have a lot of lampreys in the Potomac? That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, no, Lucy Wu is saying that these are also invasive lampreys that we have in the Potomac.
They're not native lamprey?
Well, I don't know. Tell me, Paul, are they native or invasive?
They are in the Western rivers. There's, I think, 5 species of lamprey, and they're quite important, especially to Native American tribes. They're in many ways as important as salmon are, if not for absolute protein, source, but culturally. And lamprey harvest is a very big cultural event in certain rivers in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, from British Columbia down to Northern California, maybe down.
Really?
So, but they're not the sea lamprey that got into the Great Lakes that was invasive, and that was a real problem and remains a problem. But I want to ask what those dolphins are feeding on if they're coming up in the river. Are they feeding on fish? Does anyone know?
Yeah, that's my understanding is part of the reason that they're back is because the fish are back because the water is less polluted.
Right.
And some of them are resident. They're there all the time in the lower Potomac, and some of them go out in the Chesapeake Bay. We had thought that they were gone. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. They were well known in the 19th century in the Potomac, and then they disappeared during the time period when it was so polluted. And then there was a dolphin expert, again, I mentioned her earlier, Dr. Janet Mann, who moved to the area, and she had been, I believe it was in Australia or New Zealand, and was monitoring bottlenose dolphins down there, and came up there and she looked outside her window and there she saw a dolphin. And she said, "Oh my God, I guess I'm back to it again." And so started monitoring the dolphins. But there's been great interest. But I think it's because the fish population has rebounded that they have enough to eat in the area, and probably because they can see the fish better too, because it's not as polluted.
Well, Paul and Nancy, we're getting to the end of our time, but it seems to me that there's a hopeful message here, which is that the environment, and as long as and you know, both habitat and species, as long as we don't kill the latter, have an enormous ability to rebound given the right circumstances. And I'd just like you to comment on that and how people can help that rebound, because it's sort of like the human body. It's like you cut yourself, you have a terrible wound, but you heal. You know, you bleed, but then you heal. And it seems to me that the water systems and the environmental systems have that capability and heal themselves as long as there's not more pain inflicted upon them, so to speak. You know.
Well, nature has a great ability to heal itself. So what we want to do, and I think this is true of what Paul is talking about also, is helping nature to heal itself. And the more that we can do that, get those natural systems engaged, the easier it is to do. So the mussels are an example of that. Again, the stream buffers are an example of that. Paul gave lots of examples of the kinds of things that we're doing to try to help nature heal itself.
Right. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'm an eternal optimist. I went and worked in Hawaii for a number of years, and where, you know, massive extinction event has been occurring there since Captain Cook landed. And in fact, it started before Captain Cook with the Polynesians, because they brought rats and pigs, and and they, a lot of species went extinct in the Hawaiian Islands before Captain Cook ever showed up, because they were very good eating, to the Polynesians that landed there. So there's still so many challenges to overcome. But if you identify what those challenges are, you get at what those limiting factors are for many at the species level, or for landscapes or systems like a river system, they will actually very often, usually I'd say, recover or restore themselves to some new, improved sort of stability or stasis. Obviously, climate change as an overarching macro issue is changing things a lot. There's going to be winners and losers. Like one of the, the big things with climate change here, I mentioned fire and stuff, but there's also sort of latitudinal shifts and there's altitudinal shifts. And do you have, landscapes and habitat areas that can accommodate these shifts? So the birds and the butterflies and the pollinators are, they're changing their patterns pretty dramatically. Now, is it a bad thing? Or, it's not necessarily a bad thing if they're finding a place to, to carry out their life cycle. And animals and species and plants have always adapted and shifted. So, I'm looking forward to figuring out who the, the winners and losers are on. But if you, like wolves in Oregon is a great example. Once you stop killing them, they'll do great.
Yeah,
And,
right.
They've now it causes I work with a lot of ranching communities, and there's tremendous, sort of emotional, resistance to wolves showing up. And, these guys' grandparents spent 100 years getting rid of wolves, and now they have to accommodate them. And they're dealing with all kinds of other, challenges in a very, on a very slim economic margin to make their operations work. So we try and work with them. But having said all that, as long as you remove those limiting factors, and for, like in the Potomac for bald eagles, once you cleaned up, the pesticide or, whatever it was there, like DDT,
Yep.
West, I live 3 miles from downtown Portland, and prior to getting on this call, there were two bald eagles I could see outside my window, flying around and living in downtown, but that's because it's cleaner environment now than it was 50 years ago in that area.
Yeah, bald eagles are everywhere along the Potomac now, and that's exactly right.
Famous.
Yeah. If you go to across from National Airport to Haynes Point, there's a public golf course, and if you go there at 5:30 in the morning, as sometimes I do, you'll see fox and you'll see bald eagles, within 2 golf shots of National Airport. And so they adapt and make it happen. And I'm delighted that both Nancy and Paul are working hard to do this. Anybody else who's on this call, please contribute to Nancy's organization. Please volunteer on April 22nd. And I thank you both for being part of this. This has been terrific. And Michael, who is our Office of Engagement officer for the University of Virginia's alumni group, has been fantastic. And you have emails. If anybody wants to follow up, please, by all means, do so. Parting shots, Nancy and Paul.
Well, Kerry, I just want
the last word.
I just want to invite all the UVA alums to enjoy watching the beavers and the ducks.
Oh, unhappy dagger.
That really was a parting shot, I gotta say. I just want to thank all of you for participating in this with me. It was great to be on with you, Paul, and thank you, Carrie, and thank you for all your help, Michael. And yeah, come out on the river with us and help us clean it up. I'm happy to talk to any of you anytime. It's nancy@prknetwork.org. Just send me a note. I'm happy to talk. Thanks.
And by the way, Paul, we won a national championship in, I think, women's swimming yesterday.
You tell him, Carrie.
I believe that's so. So I won't say what you can do with the ducks, but they're water creatures.
The ducks or the beavers are very good at swimming.
Apparently they couldn't beat the wahoos, the swimming fish. But anyway.
All right.
Anyway, thanks everybody. This is fun.
Nice seeing you all. Take care.
Be well.